The 49th Psalm informs us in the title that it's a psalm of the sons of Korah, or probably better, for the sons of Korah, those men who were appointed by David specifically for liturgical purposes in the temple. And the title also informs us that it was for the director of music, or perhaps choir masters in some translation, one who most likely would arrange the psalms to be sung for special occasions. That's fairly normal in the psalms. But what's unusual about this psalm is whereas most other psalms offer worship to God, this one rather offers instructions to men. And what's more, the instruction the psalmist offers here is arranged in a way that is very much like the teacher of wisdom in the book of Proverbs, in the same way that he presented his teachings. Have a look at verses 1 to 3. Verse 1. Hear this, all you peoples. Listen, all who live in this world, both low and high, rich and poor alike. Verse 2. My mouth shall utter words of wisdom, the utterance of my heart will give understanding. And then verse 3. I will turn my ear to a proverb, with the harp I'll expound my riddle. So you can see the psalmist here uses that familiar two-line rhythmic arrangement that the teacher of Proverbs often used when he wrote and composed his work. But then, unlike the Proverbs, the psalmist here puts his teaching to music. Verse 3, with the harp I'll expound my riddle. So we might say that this psalm is a musical proverb, where the psalmist, having inclined his ear and after deep meditation, has gained understanding into something that he calls a riddle, and which he in turn intends to express in terms of wisdom, all set to music. And so, like Proverbs, which are essentially wise instructions for life, this psalmist wants his hearers to hear something very important also. What does he want us to learn? What's this riddle he solved after meditating and gaining understanding intended to teach us? Well, firstly note, it's a lesson that he wants all people to learn. And just like the teacher of wisdom in the Proverbs, his teaching, his message is aimed at all people, everywhere, and indeed at all times. So in other words, it's not just for the Hebrews who trace their ancestry through Abraham, but to all humanity, which traces its ancestry through Adam. Verse 1. Hear this, all peoples. Then so that we don't understand him by thinking he might be saying something like this, hear this, all peoples of Israel, he then says, listen, all who live in this world. So Jew and Gentile alike. But then to underline his universal call and leave no room for anyone who might say, oh, pardon me, I didn't realize you were talking to me. He used a somewhat rare word also found in Psalm 17 and verse 14, which means, and is translated there, men of this world, whose reward is in, or portion is, this life. And the point is, he's speaking to all people who share a common humanity, all whose portion is this like, or if you like, all who share in mortality, and not simply all who share in some kind of common geography. So the psalmist wants all people, everywhere, and irrespective of their nationality, to hear what his meditations, his understanding, and his wisdom has to teach about the riddle he solved. But then, notice verse 2. That is, its intended audience not only includes all people, but includes all people belonging to every strata of humanity as well. Verse 2. Both low and high, poor and rich alike. So he's indicating that nobody is exempt from his teaching. And it's as if he's anticipating someone saying, "Oh, I do beg your pardon, I thought you were talking to those important people, or those learned people, not to people, a simple person like myself." Or on the other hand, he may have that in mind, someone who would say, "Oh, you meant me as well. I thought your lesson was for the unlearned, for the people who need an education, not for us academics." Maybe he anticipated someone thinking, "Surely he's not talking to us, successful, cultured folk. We who've done well and are pillars of respect in society, surely he doesn't think we have anything to learn from him." Or again, conversely, perhaps he anticipates some penniless beggar saying, "What's learning got to do with me? It's enough just to survive. Never mind giving me some pointless lessons to learn." No, the psalmist says his lesson is for all people, of all nations, from every strata of society, high and low, rich and poor alike. And so, having established that the psalmist's message is a universal message that includes nobody but includes everybody, the question is, well, what's he saying? What's he on about? And what the psalmist is on about is introduced in the 5th verse. And you'll notice again the way he presents his subject in the way that the wise teacher in Proverbs sometimes presented his teachings. And he began with the investigative why. And that why tells us what had troubled the psalmist to such a degree that he could speak of his concern as being a riddle. Now, a riddle by definition is a question or statement intentionally phrased so as to require ingenuity in ascertaining its answer or meaning. That's quite a mouthful, isn't it? Let me repeat it again. A riddle by definition is a question or statement intentionally phrased so as to require ingenuity in ascertaining its answer or meaning. So an example of a riddle might be something like this. Everyone wants more of it to feel special, yet the more you have of it, the less special you feel. You see, it's a question posed that requires ingenuity to arrive at its answer. In other words, the answer isn't easy, and it takes some contemplation, some meditation to solve the riddle. So the it in the riddle, everyone wants more of it to feel special, yet the more of it you have, the less special you feel, is knowledge. It teaches that the more knowledge you gain, the more you realize how unknowledgeable you are, and the less special you feel because of it. And arriving at that answer, it required meditation to understand the riddle. And so the psalmist, by asking this question in verse 5, tells us what had been troubling him in such a way that he should think of it as a riddle. Verse 5. Why should I fear when evil days come, when wicked deceivers surround me, those who trust in their wealth and boast of their riches? And this issue troubled him so much that he alluded to the problem in various other places in the psalm. Verse 16, for example, do not be overawed when a rich man grows rich, when the splendor of his house increases. And so as we read through the psalm, what we see is what had set the psalmist off on his downward spiral of thought was when he saw the riches, the increase of the riches and the comfort and the power of the wicked. An increase which brought praise and adulation from their peers, verse 18, but also harm to himself in spite of his righteous life, verse 5. And it seems that circumstances had so presented themselves where the psalmist who had lived as a righteous man found himself personally cheated, troubled, and threatened by those who had lived very unrighteous lives. These were they who, in verse 5, were causing him personal loss, whilst they grew richer by using unfair methods. He says they were deceivers. ESV speaks of them as being cheats. Now, we're not told exactly what was transpiring. And it could have been something as basic as tampered weights when measuring out grain. They cheated in what they sold by weight. It could have been something like the enlarging of territory over set boundaries, perhaps theirs over his. Or maybe in a question of injustice, where there was compensation due over injury. Or perhaps even matters to do with laws concerning a ransom paid. Because it's possible in a close reading of the psalmist's complaint to see some of these things hinted at from verse 5 onwards in very subtle ways. But whatever the reason, one thing is clear, and that is that the psalmist says he's being treated unfairly by those who have the sheer weight of numbers and the luxury of riches and brute power on their side. And it's the age-old problem of the powerful treating the weak with contempt, and the weak unable to do anything about the way that they're being treated. And the psalmist describes these people very clearly in this psalm. He says in verse 5, they deceive, they manipulate for profit at the expense of the weak. Verse 6, they were rich and they boasted about their riches. Verse 11 and 16, they had sumptuous houses and even lands named after themselves. Verse 13, they had an unsound sense of confidence in themselves. They were proud and arrogant. In verses 13 and 18, they had acolytes who encouraged their boasting. Probably people like themselves, or people who wanted to be like them. And because of their abundance, their power, and their popularity, they seem to have become a law unto themselves at the expense of the weak and humble who couldn't do anything about it. So these circumstances are what move the psalmist to meditate in his heart and to gain understanding. And the result of his contemplation is the composing of his riddle for life. Very well then, we've considered that this psalm is to all people. And we've considered something of what we glean from it, of the background, what produced the psalm. It was the unrighteous suffering at the hands of the wicked. So we still ask the question, what is the psalmist's riddle? What is this riddle? What is his question? Stated in this way with ingenuity and requires deep contemplation to be answered. And I suppose if I were to attempt to paraphrase the psalmist's riddle, I would say something like this in the words of Jesus in Matthew chapter 16 and verse 26. There Jesus said, "What good is it for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? Or what shall a man give in exchange for his soul?" Now there's a riddle. But now look at what Jesus said in parabolic form about a seemingly intelligent man who did just that. And you'll find that in Luke chapter 12 and verses 16 to 21. This is what Jesus said. The ground of a certain rich man produced a good crop. He thought to himself, what shall I do? For I have no place to store my crops. Then he said, this is what I'll do. I'll tear down my barns and build bigger ones. And there I'll store all my grain and my goods. And I'll say to myself, you have plenty of good things laid up for many years. Take life easy. Eat, drink, and be merry. And there we have a picture of one who has worked hard. Unlike the sluggard in the Proverbs, this man has worked hard. He's anticipated trouble and made every provision for when things might get a bit tight, or when he wouldn't have his youth to sustain his lifestyle as older age came upon him. So you might say that this man applied his natural abilities, his intelligence, his lessons learnt in life, and he engaged his opportunities so as to do well, and so as to ensure that as he lived, so he would die, comfortable, satisfied, carefree. What did Jesus say about that seemingly impressive man? Fool. Fool. That's what Jesus said. Verse 20, you fool. This very night your life will be demanded from you. Then who will get what you have prepared for yourself? And then the postscript, same verse. This is how it will be with anyone who stores up things for himself but is not rich towards God. You see, that's the crux of the riddle. The worth of a soul and the price of a soul compared to anything else. And that's why the psalmist is concerned to express his meditations to everyone, to Jew and Gentile, to low and high alike, to rich and poor, because everyone has a soul. And no matter how hard you might try to argue it away, or to blot out the fact of his existence through drinking or drugs or sex, or riches or fame, or the applause of others as to your worth, the niggling problem still remains that every person has a sense that they're made for something better than just food and drink and the applause of this world. That there's more to life than just work and sleep and satisfying your feelings and death. And the reason for that niggle is because every person, high or low, rich or poor, has an intangible, precious, immortal soul. That God-given spiritual identity, which can never be satisfied simply by what the natural, physical and temporal things of this life can offer. You see, that's what separates man from the rest of animal creation. Because man alone of all creatures is made in the image of God. God formed man, and he breathed into him the breath of life, and he made man for eternity with an eternal soul. And nothing in the realm of creation, no matter how impressive or how costly, can ever compare to the preciousness of a man's soul. And ultimately, while man is meant in his image bearing, not merely to have dominion over the earth, to rule over it and to enjoy the creation, first and foremost, He's made to worship and to enjoy God forever. But that's unfortunately where, because of our fallen natures, our sinful natures, that universal disease that we share in and trace back right back to Adam, and because of our finite and physical composition, that's why we're all prone to live lives transfixed on the physical and the tangible, while rarely giving a thought to the spiritual and the eternal. It's a state that the Bible describes as spiritual blindness, ignorance, death, being in bondage to or a slave of sin. Listen to what the Apostle Paul says, as he puts it this way in 2 Corinthians in chapter 4 and verse 4. The God of this age has blinded the minds of unbelievers, so that they cannot see the light of the glory of the gospel of the glory of God. And Paul's inference here is that the devil who seduced Adam to sin through fleshly desire continues to hold his progeny in that state of spiritual blindness by seducing them to thirst after and contemplate and enjoy only which the flesh wants: food, drink, sex, riches, fame, comfort. So that in varying degrees the lives of those in their natural state are characterized, in fact, by the lives of the unrighteous in the 49th Psalm. In fact, if you were to look at how Paul described all who live without thought for God in Romans 3, you'd find a scathing review of how he saw such people. A review that makes the psalmist here seem almost complimentary by comparison. So in a sense, those troubled ones in Psalm 49 are but descriptive of all mankind without God. They're descriptive of the natural trajectory of sin in man when it's left unchecked. Now, you might say to me that I'm being rather unfair in my assessment. That yes, you have the odd bad apple, but surely the majority of people are good people, aren't they? And my answer to you is that that's not my assessment, but that's the Bible's assessment of fallen man. That's what man without God is like, the psalmist says in verse 20. Left as he is, without understanding, he's like the beasts that perish. You see, what the psalmist is saying is that those who have no thought for their immortal souls and for fulfilling what they're being designed to do as creatures of God, that is, not just ruling over and having dominion over the earth, but first and foremost, knowing and walking in communion with God, these, by living entitled to satisfy themselves, their desires and their cravings, these are in effect no different to the beasts of the field, who weren't made in God's image and for communion with Him, but who were made simply to follow their basely instincts. So it's not that man can't do good, rather that when he's left to himself and without constraint, in the final analysis, he lives only to himself. And if, as in this psalm, satisfying his self-interest means treading down the poor or the righteous or the weak, then left unchecked, he has the natural propensity to do just that. And the frustration the psalmist was enduring, the iniquity of the rich unchecked and growing richer, boasting, cheating, and in his suffering as a righteous man, powerless to do anything about it, the psalmist focusing on the painful realities of life and losing sight of the realities of eternity, sunk down into a deep state of fear and depression. That's what brought forth his riddle. But But it was at that point of despair. Like the psalmist in Psalm 73, when he entered into the sanctuary of God, it was there when he remembered the whole picture viewed from eternity. And that's where he brought forth the answer to his riddle. And the riddle the psalmist proposes, as I've mentioned to it earlier in the words of Jesus, is the riddle of the soul's worth. How much? How much is a soul worth? Can you put a price on it? Is it worth $1,000? $1 trillion? Verse 7 says, no man can redeem the life of another or give to God a ransom for him. The ransom for a life is costly, and no payment is ever enough. So the psalmist, in remembering, going through this, contemplating it, remembering, he comes to realize again that he's just in the antechamber to something far greater. And he says that the price of a soul is priceless. That's the perspective we need to look at. And remember, Jesus said the same thing in a different way when he rhetorically asks, what good would it be for a man if he gains the whole world, yet forfeits his soul? And the unspoken answer, of course, is nothing. It will profit him nothing. If a man could gain the whole world, imagine it, total ownership, total control of the entire planet to use as you will, what will it gain you? Nothing. And that's amazing, isn't it? Especially when we contemplate how men and women wait to live and to work and to buy and to sell and to indulge their desires. And as they have children, to teach them to engage in everything at their disposal, to do the same thing as if that's all there is to life. But if that's all there is to life, then Jesus says it's nothing. So here's the riddle. The pricelessness of something intangible. The worthlessness of gaining everything. Let me ask you, how do you measure riches? What value do you put this morning on your soul? You see, these are questions worth thinking about in our busy lives. Today, with the rush and tear, the shifting of social values, violence, disasters, all these things that tend to make life seem so cheap, it does us well to stop and to think and to meditate and to ask, are my values the Bible's values? Does my life express a life lived to something greater than just the here and the now? Or am I just living as a brute beast, driven by instinct? And those questions are worth asking because how we answer them in lives in flesh, acting out what we believe, has eternal consequences. And the eternal consequences the psalmist teaches are one of two. Verse 15, speaking of himself as a man who had realized his soul's worth and his creation mandate in its comprehensiveness, he says, but God will redeem my life from the grave. He will surely take me to himself. But then by contrast, verse 19, speaking of the wicked, of those who haven't contemplated their soul's worth, and so live like the beasts who perish, he says, he will join the generation of the fathers who will never see the light of life. Now the word translated grave here is actually the word Sheol, which can have a number of connotations. It can mean, as the NIV is translated here, the grave, the place where the body has been committed. It can mean the realm of death, a state after life. And it can mean hell, the place of final and eternal punishment. And while we would be on thin ground to say that the psalmist had in mind hell here, given that it's not until the New Testament that we have a full-blown understanding of the afterlife and the destiny of the unrighteous, he says enough of his soul being received by God, whereas the wicked will never see the light of life. And that's a thought he's expressed earlier, isn't it? Concerning the eternal state of the soul after death. He said in verses 14 and 15, like sheep, they, that is the wicked, are destined for the grave, and death will feed on them. The upright will rule over them in the morning. Their form will decay in the grave, far from their princely mansions. But God will redeem my life or my soul from the grave, for he will surely take me to himself. How we value and view our souls has eternal consequences. So then, the psalmist's call is to all people, because all people have a soul. And he came to express his teaching because of the injustice he was suffering at the hand of the wicked, who were like half people, living like the beasts of the earth, fulfilling only half their creation mandate, living as if they were soulless, only driven by animal instinct. Then he presented his findings in what I've termed the riddle of the soul, that the soul is precious, but it's also eternal. That once the soul is disconnected, disembodied from the perishable body, it will continue on eternally in either one of two states, either that of comfort or suffering. But the last thing that can't be omitted from our study of this psalm is the word ransom. He used with regard to the soul in verse 8. And like the word Sheol, the word ransom doesn't take on its full biblical meaning until the New Testament. In the Old Testament, it carried with it the meaning of buying back or redeeming, and was often used with regard to civil law, where the redeemer or kinsman redeemer had certain rights to redeem lands or even relatives. So the biblical concept, essentially, of redemption means a price being paid in order to purchase back what was in some way lost. But those who know their Bibles well know that the New Testament fulfillment of all the Old Testament types of Redeemer and redemption are found in Jesus Christ, the Redeemer of sinners. He said himself, didn't he, that he came to redeem that which was lost, and that his life was given as a ransom for many. And that redemption he spoke of, he accomplished through his life being laid down for others, when he offered himself as a sacrifice for sinners on the cross, when he paid the redemption price for the punishment of our sins. And in the grey of the Old Testament, where all the details of the coming Redeemer had yet not been fully disclosed, still hints were given. And in verse 18, one of those hints is found, where the psalmist said, "But God will redeem my life from the grave. He will surely take me to himself." That his soul wouldn't inhabit the grave, rather that God would receive his eternal soul when it parted from his mortal body. That God himself would welcome him. And what a wonderful thought that is to all who know God. That because the kinsman redeemer, because of all that he accomplished on the cross, that their soul will go through the process of mortality running its course, but then be with Christ forever. And at what great cost! the suffering and atoning death of the Redeemer, God's one and only Son, Jesus Christ. What's a soul worth to God? This, that it took nothing less than the eternal Word, the second person of the divine and triune Godhead, to take on flesh and to die that horrific atoning death on the cross in order to save it. That's what it's worth. Well then, why did the psalmist say, "Why should I fear in times of trouble?" Because he knew his kinsman Redeemer. That after the fight was fought, and after the dust had settled, he would take him to himself, and he would be vindicated over his enemies. Have you understood this morning the riddle of the soul's worth? Because if you do, you too will agree with the psalmist that this life, with all its struggles and its pains and its injustices, is just the antechamber to something greater. And the best is yet to come.